Today's reading is Hebrews chapter 4, verse 14 to chapter 5, verse 3. Therefore, since we have a great high priest who has gone through the heavens, Jesus the Son of God, let us hold firmly to the faith we profess. For we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but we have one who has been tempted in every way, just as we are, yet was without sin. Let us then approach the throne of grace with confidence, so that we may receive mercy and find grace to help us in our time of need. Every high priest is selected from among men and is appointed to represent them in matters related to God, to offer gifts and sacrifices for sins. He is able to deal gently with those who are ignorant and are going astray, since he himself is subject to weakness. This is why he has to offer sacrifices for his own sins, as well as for the sins of the people.
Thank you, Yolanda. And we're going to be looking at those verses together this morning. And I've given this sermon the title this morning, The Withness of Jesus. And when the team saw that, they were like, oh, is that a spelling mistake, Stephen? No, it's not. This idea of witness, Jesus being with us, is something that we've celebrated for thousands of years as God's people, right back to that famous psalm, Psalm 23, verse 4, which says, even though I am walking through death's darkest valley, I will not be afraid. Why? Because he is with us. And that's what we're going to be thinking about this morning. We're going to be continuing our sermon series, which is traveling alongside this book. And if you haven't had a chance to read it or listen to it, if you're into audiobooks, I would encourage you to have a look. It's not a particularly long book, but it's rich, full of lots of fantastic theology about the heart of Jesus and his heart towards us. So really encourage you, if you haven't had a chance to look at this yet, to have a read. So our key verse this morning then that we're going to be looking at is chapter 4, verse 15, which says this: For we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize or empathize with our weakness, but we have one who has been tempted in every way, just as we are, yet he did not sin. Now, this is one of the most amazing theological statements in the Bible, and this morning I want to tell you why. And we're going to actually look at the context around this verse because it will really bring it to life for us. So if we look at this verse and the verses either side, verse 14 says that since we have, if we go on to the next, since we have a great high priest who has ascended into heaven, Jesus the Son of God, let us hold firmly to the faith we profess. Here we see the key point here is an encouragement to faithfulness. Let us hold firmly to the faith that we profess. Then verse 16, the verse after, says, let us then approach God's throne with grace, with confidence, so that we may receive mercy and find grace to help us in our time of need. And the key point here is to have confidence in our relationship with God. Let us approach God's throne of grace with confidence. So the big question here this morning is, why are these factors important? Keep hanging in there. We're going to do a bit more study and then we'll get on to looking at how this applies to our life. Like an onion, this passage is packed full of truth and we got to peel it back one layer at a time. And there's a couple of key words here that are really important to link. That first one there, for, at the beginning of verse 15. This grounds, we see that verse 14 is grounded by verse 15. Verse 14 would mean nothing if it wasn't for verse 15. We hold firmly. Why? Well, because of verse 15. Likewise, in verse 16, it says, then approach. Again, this is telling us that verse 15 is the key because it's grounded there off the back of verse 16. We can approach with confidence. Why? Why can we approach with confidence? Well, because of verse 15. I hope you're getting the point, and I won't labor the point anymore. That verse 15 is really, really key to understanding the truth that the writer of Hebrews is trying to get across to us this morning. Now, when it comes to the ancient Near East, and when it comes to most religions, and certainly in the lives of Christians living in Torbay in 2021, our natural human inclination is to believe that Jesus is with us, that he is on our side, and that he's only present and helping us when things are going well. That's our natural inclination. But the text here actually says the opposite. It is in our weakness that Jesus sympathizes or empathizes with us when we are at our most broken, when we're at our most weakest. And if you look at this word, you keep hearing me saying sympathize and empathize, and I'm kind of throwing the words backwards and forwards here. If you look at the original word, it's actually what's called a compound word, which means it's two words that are joined together. The first word, the prefix is co or with, and the verb there is to suffer. So if you put those words together, the better translation would be to say, for we do not have a high priest who is unable to co-suffer with our weakness, but we have one who has been tempted and tried in every way. So what does that mean, though? What does that mean for us that we have a heavenly God, that we have a deity, that we have someone who we choose to follow, who says that they co-suffer with us right here on earth? And it's not saying that Jesus is detached and he's like pitying us from a distance, but there's a deep sense of solidarity with us. In our pain, Jesus is pained. In our suffering, he feels the suffering as his own, even though it isn't. In no way does this mean his divinity is threatened, simply that his heart is drawn to our distress. Let me say that again. That is amazing. His heart is drawn to our distress. His human nature, his shared experience engages with our troubles. His love cannot be held back when he sees his people in pain. His love cannot be held back when he sees his people in pain. And this, my friends, is where we see the witness of Jesus at work. I spend a lot of my time around people who are dying. This week I was with two people who were dying, and I just wish that I could have that opportunity to sit alongside the bedside of everyone, because it's such a precious moment there. As a pastor in a larger church, it's really hard because I want to be with all of you all of the time through all that you're going through. And yet I'm a human being who can't be in all places at once. And this draws me great comfort to know that our God is omnipresent. He is with every single one of us, and he wants to be with you. Now, the real scandal of verse 15 is what we're told about why Jesus is so close with his people in their pain. So what is the scandal here? Let's look at it again. Number one, he has been tempted and tested in every way. And not just that, but in every respect, just as we are. Just let that sit for a while. He has been tempted and tested in every way, just as we are. I wonder if you could think for a moment to the parts of your lives, whether it be deep pain, whether it be deep suffering, whether it be that temptation and trials, and you think how hard that felt, how awful that felt, and to think that Jesus knows what that feels like. In his co-suffering with us, in his solidarity, he has taken this journey himself. Not only does he bring peace into the midst of our struggles, but in some cases he brings relief. Like a doctor who prescribes medication. He's not just a doctor prescribing medication, but he's like the doctor who has suffered the same disease. Now, what we need to remind ourselves of here is that Jesus was a sinless human, not a sinless superhuman. I don't know if any of you watch any of the Marvel films. I know I quite enjoy them. And you've got these superhuman people that have come onto the earth. And sometimes, especially maybe for a generation that's emerging right now, the idea of thinking about Jesus is that somehow he was this superhuman. But the Bible tells us, when you begin to study it and look below the layers, that Jesus, yes, was 100% God, but he was also 100% human. I believe he woke up with bad hair, with a bad hair day, probably woke up with bad breath, He probably had spots as a teenager. He certainly wouldn't have stood out for his looks. Isaiah says that in Isaiah 53, verse 2. He had no beauty that we should desire him. He came as a normal man and knows what it is to be thirsty, hungry, despised, rejected, scorned, shamed, embarrassed, abandoned, misunderstood, falsely accused, suffocated, tortured, and killed. He knows what it is to be lonely, to have friends abandon him when he needed them most. In today's language, he would have had every Twitter follower, every Facebook friend unfriending him. When your relationships go sour, when you get that, what's the point feeling? When it feels like life is just passing us by, when it feels like the one shot of significance we had has slipped through our fingers, when we can't sort our emotions out, when a long-term friend lets us down, when a family member betrays us, when we feel deeply misunderstood, when we are laughed at by the impressive, when the fallenness of the world closes in around us and makes us want to throw in the towel, it's right there in that moment that we have a friend who knows exactly what such testing feels like. Again, our instinct as human beings is to feel that the more that life gets difficult, the more alone we are. Isn't that true? The more life gets difficult, the more alone we feel. As we sink further into pain, as we sink further into isolation. Sisters and brothers, this is where the Bible corrects us. Our pain never outstrips what he himself shares in. We are never alone. That sorrow that feels so unique, that sorrow that feels so isolating, was endured by him in the past and now is shared with him in the present. The key to understanding verse 15 is to understand that in every respect he was tried and tested and tempted just as we are, and yet was without sin. So I wonder if this presents us with a problem. We know that our lives are tainted by sin, and we all have to wrestle with those feelings of guilt and shame. And yet we are told that Jesus was holy, he was innocent, and he was unstained. So the question I was asking myself as I was looking at this is, does this dilute this idea of just as we are? You know, he was tempted and tried in every way just as we are. Well, but Jesus didn't know what it's like to fall to sin. He didn't know what it felt like to be enticed by sin to the point where you just give up, facing trials of every kind and collapsing under its pressure, bewildered by those things in your life that you just can't stop doing, perplexed that despite the forgiveness that Jesus offers, we continue to fail. Does this in somehow dilute those words? How does this compare with the utter purity of Christ? Now, our good friend C.S. Lewis helps us out here, and I'm grateful for C.S. Lewis. He encourages us with two reasons that we shouldn't be discouraged at this point. Number one is that Jesus knows what it's like to be tempted better than we do. Like a person, he says in his book called Mere Christianity, like a person walking against the wind. Once the wind gets too much, the temptation for all of us is we just lie down and give up, therefore not knowing what it might have been like 10 minutes later. But Jesus never laid down. He endured temptation. He endured testing without ever giving in, which means that he knows the strength of temptation better than any of us. And he also knows the cost. Not only that, but the second hope is that the one who shares in our pain shares it as the pure and the holy one, which means that our sinless high priest is not only the one who needs rescuing, but provides it. This is why we can go and find grace and mercy from him. He's not trapped in the hole of sin with us. It's only he alone that can pull us out. His sinlessness is our salvation. Not only can he pull us out of the hole, but he alone desires to climb in and to bear our burdens, to co-suffer with us. Let's just look at this quote from the book, which says this: if you are in Christ, You have a friend who, in your sorrow, will never lob down a pep talk from heaven. He cannot bear to hold himself at a distance. Nothing can hold him back. His heart is too bound up with yours. Isn't that amazing truth? Nothing can hold him back. His heart is bound with yours. Let's just go back to the text one last time and consider how he deals with us. This comes in the latter part of what Yolanda read to us. And I want to read this from the Passion Translation, chapter 5, verse 2. It says, since the high priest, which, by the way, that's a whole other sermon on its own. Why are we referring to Jesus as a high priest here? But it's simply talking about Jesus. Since the high priest is also one who is clothed with weakness, he humbles himself by showing compassion to those who are ignorant of God's ways and stray from them. Friends, the good news is that he deals gently with us. That's what we've been talking about so far in this series. Let me share this other quote with you from the book, this last quote. It says this, look to Christ. He deals gently with you. It's the only way he knows how to be. He is the high priest to end all high priests. As long as you fix your attention on your sin, you will fail to see how you can, there's a spelling mistake there, how you can fail to be safe. But as long as you look to this high priest, you will never fail to see how you can be in danger. When we're fixated on our sin, when we're fixated on our weakness, when we're fixated on all our woes and our worries, we do get that sinking feeling of isolation and lostness. But when we focus on Jesus as our Savior and our friend, all of a sudden those feelings of isolation and weakness and vulnerability to begin to evaporate. And I want to say to anyone here this morning who's never experienced that peace that transcends all understanding in the midst of the most vile storm, it's just amazing. It's just beyond words. As you can imagine, I've been having lots of conversation with Andy this week as they've been journeying through this dark valley that they're going through right now. And I think if he was stood here this morning, he would tell you the same thing, that despite the fact they're facing one of the most horrendous things that any human being can face, there is a sense that God is right there in the midst of it with them. And that's good news for them, and it's good news for us as well this morning. In a moment, I'm going to be asking the band to come up to lead us in a time of reflection. But before we get there, let's not rush into this idea of the saving power of Jesus. The saving power of Jesus is very important. We know that Jesus died on the cross for us, and each and every one of us who wants to take up that invitation can receive that gift of grace and mercy this morning. But just ponder for a moment this morning on the heart of Jesus, the heart that he has towards you. And I want us to think as we end about the time Jesus was here on earth. And particularly if you look at the Gospel of John, John is very keen on reminding us about Jesus' human nature. And I wonder if you remember the time that Jesus heard about his friend Lazarus. He was a couple of days away. Well, he was actually quite close by, just up the road in Bethany, and he heard about his friend Lazarus had died. And yet he took 2 days to join the crowd and the disciples. And by the time he got there, his friend Lazarus had died. And everyone was perplexed with him. Why didn't you come sooner? If you'd only been here, our friend wouldn't have died. And yet Jesus knew what his Father was doing. And he knew his Father's will was for him not to ride in triumphantly and save the day. And the text says at that point that when Jesus was confronted by the tomb, when Jesus was confronted by the cacophony of weeping and wailing, it doesn't say there in the text that Jesus began to whimper or that Jesus shed a few tears. It describes the sense that Jesus burst into tears, that he wept with those who were there. And it was at that moment that he saw others weeping. He saw everyone else's pain. Now, Jesus doesn't sweep into the scene straight away and declare that tears are beside the point there. Why are you crying? It's a waste of time. Lazarus isn't dead. He's only sleeping. Even though, of course, his actions and his words will shortly make clear that Jesus had no doubt what he saw his Father doing. But there wasn't this immediate sense of triumphalism, of somehow coming in smugly with a secret formula that will show you how clever he is. There's rather this man of sorrow who's acquainted with our grief and our pain, sharing and bearing it to the point of tears. Now, this is a point where I'm going to ask Matt and Kim and Jill to come up and begin to lead us. And as we're going into this time of singing together, there'll be two songs. The first song, very much we want to use as a time to reflect, to encourage you to listen to the words that are sung over you. Some of you may want to stand and sing along, but others of you may just want to sit back and reflect. And then we'll sing another song where we all stand and join together and sing. But as you're reflecting, as you're thinking, I want you to try to just take yourself to maybe some of those darkest places in your heart, where maybe some of those secrets are buried, the things that we're most ashamed of, most concerned about, maybe some of the pain that you've never shared with anyone or never told anyone about. And I just encourage you this morning to invite Jesus into that place, to recognize that this man of sorrow co-suffers with us. He comes in and he recognizes and he knows that pain. And he wants to bring healing to you this morning. He's drawn towards that pain. He's drawn towards that isolation. He's drawn towards that sin. So just allow him to minister to you now.